From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark. Rick Pluta is away this week. More than 2.5 million Michiganders turned out to vote in this year's primary election. But there was a big gap in the number of Democrats and Republicans who voted. What should we make of the fact that so many more Democrats turned out to vote last week? Joining us for some answers is Corwin Smith. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University. Professor, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just start at the top. What do we know about overall turnout in last week's primary election? How many folks voted total?
Well, over 2.5 million did vote, which is pretty much, you can call it a modern day record. And it's really hard. It's really much of an apples and oranges comparison because you have different laws and different registrations. One issue, though, people might point to is we have a lot more registered voters than we have in the past. But even then, we're at about 30% of registered voters turned out. So that's still really, really high.
What can that tell us?
Well, there's good news and bad news. One, people are paying attention to politics. Sometimes people think that means all good things, but some people only vote when they're upset about things. So that could also mean that things aren't working out too well for people in the country. So when you see high turnout, it does mean that, well, the system's working in some respects, but it also means that maybe there's something that's a little off that makes people want to turn out. I think one thing we also have to be mindful of is that it's a lot easier to vote in Michigan since, at least more recently, since 2018. And so there's a lot more access and availability. So although in the past, whereas turnout may have been higher, we're sort of seeing the turnout that we would have seen if we had sort of more accessible voting laws.
There was a big difference in turnout between Democrats and Republicans in the gubernatorial race. What's going on there?
Yeah, so when you do top of the ticket, you can get really enamored or look into sort of where all the county differences are. Usually, and it's true that usually that's a good indicator of who's going to win in the general. But I just sort of push back on that a little. August primary elections are notoriously sort of these elections in Michigan where people may vote for a different party because of local issues. I just point to like Ottawa County, which is Holland, Michigan, traditionally a very Republican county. Lately, it had a huge local partisan fight with the county board, Impact Ottawa. In 2024, only about 14% of people who voted in August primary voted Democrat. Now is up to more than 44%. That's a range of 30%. Now, we could either talk about that as, oh, look, they're more interested in voting for the Democrat, that county is more supportive of Democrats now or more interested in the Democratic Party. Or you could see it as, no, there was a local race that pushed them to vote Republican in 2024. And we have these a lot in Michigan. You might get upset at your local county treasurer or your, local township clerk or something like that. And you might vote in the primary to get them ousted because that township is a predominantly Democratic township or predominantly Republican township.
Did we learn anything about turnout in the U.S. Senate race?
Yeah, we learned a lot of things. One, there's sort of fun stuff going on with turnout in Michigan, right? So when you have when you're looking at, there was a non-contest, right, in the Republican side.
Yeah.
And on the governor's side, it was seen as, largely not that competitive, although there were some debates about how competitive it was. On the Democratic side, what you had was turnout in certain areas that maybe aren't Democratic primary voting areas, but may still be Democratic areas. What we saw, say, in a Dearborn that has a high MENA or Arab American population, is that turnout was very, very high. I've had some colleagues and I have looked back at 2024 and sort of this data, and Arab American voting turnout in Michigan is variable. And in some cases, it goes towards the Republicans. In some cases, it goes towards the Democrats, depending on who's running. So these sorts of things sort of indicate maybe where Abdul El-Sayed has sort of picked up the electorate. So what we saw was higher turnout, say, in West Michigan and Ottawa and Kent. That suggests a certain level of appeal that may have mobilized certain voters. It may also indicate a different type of voters living in those areas as well. So you see some indicators from turnout that oh, certain areas may be more interested or more a candidate may be or more appealing and may turn out voters higher, or you see some indication that the candidate is sort of changing sort of the balance of the party calculation and what sort of party they're interested in.
So we saw that this year.
We saw it in some cases. We could point to, Ottawa and Kent certainly as ones that sort of moved. What's fascinating is like places like, say, Washington, like Ann Arbor and Washtenaw, those are 70% Democratic areas anyways, so you don't see much movement there. What's really cool is when you look at these other counties, you look further down where they're traditional Republican counties, you see ranges of 30 to 40%. So some of the bigger ranges we see, as I said, it was like Ottawa County, which shows a huge swing. Now, some of that might be explained of what was going on in Ottawa County before. Otherwise, you might say, no, there are sort of people there who are more appealed in Ottawa County who moved from the Republicans to the Democrats and are more willing to support more Democrats coming into 2026.
What surprised you about these results?
Honestly, I would push back a little bit on people saying this was a high, a massively unexpected high turnout. That wasn't necessarily the case. I had some expectation that it would be near this. I think people need to understand that we in Michigan have had a series of really highly competitive elections and had really high turnout. And, we had record turnout in 2024. We have a lot of people who are paying, who know their candidates and are attentive to politics. We've had redistricting multiple times. We've had, sort of open seats at the state legislator level. So we've had all this sort of turnout generation. And a lot of people have been now know where their voting precinct is. They have already signed up to get mail ballots. They already have taken advantages of all the access that we've had in the system since we passed changes in the law in 2018. So what's happened then is that we've had this system where now people are institutionalized and have greater access to voting. So what is perhaps surprising is people were shocked that turnout was this high. I would probably suggest that turnout is going to be more like this in the future because if we've had these really high competitive presidential elections, we're a battleground state, people are going to be in the voter list. They're going to be in these campaign caller lists. They're going to be in the mailer list, and they're going to be getting these mailers telling them to go out to vote. So we might be seeing just a constantly high August primary turnout in Michigan going forward. So that's one. Not to belabor the point, but two, I think when it comes to surprising thing, I think some people are going to read too much into the partisan split. I think I was really, really surprised by the partisan split. I would say that. I didn't think it would be as extreme, but going into the data more, I realized that it's much variable. We have ranges of 30 to 40% by counties in terms of year to year or election to election and where they vote. So whereas it might be an indicator of something, I was sort of taken aback and looking at the data and looking back to 2018, 2020, 2022. It's fascinating. Some of these places go 50-50 Democrat, Republican, and then the next election, they're 2/3 one party or the other. So it's really variable, and I don't know how reliable of an indicator it is going forward.
What do you make of that variability?
Well, again, we in Michigan have really highly localized elections. You can make Thomas Jefferson for that. When Michigan was sort of platted, he thought we should have townships, and we have all these minor townships. And we've had recent zoning fights. If you drive to Grand Rapids and get off at the Lowell exit, you hear all about how their Lowell Township people are upset about Lowell Township trustees and the Microsoft data center. And so, who's to say, when you get to those primaries, who's to say how much of this is a national issue versus is a local issue? Again, back in 2024, 2022, you have places like Ottawa County where it was very much a localized issue driving turnout. You had places in, Salina areas where a data center and zoning rules and referendas were put into place. You have zoning turnout depending on the township going on. So, it's fun. I think we have this very localized electorate system, and sometimes in August primary, it becomes very localized interpretations of how that turnout is developed and what makes people want to turn out to vote. But then they end up still voting in the national races like Senate. So that ends up being sort of interesting depending on, who knows? You could argue maybe, zoning fight in Cascade Township is the reason why Abdul al-Sayed won, because it generated enough people to turn out to vote. Those sort of random things sort of come into play. And it's kind of fun to think about those things, even though they're kind of hard to prove.
So taking what you know about the electorate and turnout, what does all of this tell us vis-a-vis predictions for turnout come November?
Oh, well, one, let me just take a step back here and say, given what we know, don't trust the polls because a lot of the pollsters, even now, they're sort of showing their data and it's meaningless. They don't understand Michigan data. They're using vendors that have bad data, that have inaccurate data. They claim to have understanding of how turnout works in the past, but it's not. If you actually look at the government data, it doesn't really support that. So one, be very mindful of what pollsters are putting out because they're going to model electorate based on sort of what people say. Generally, though, this is not, I would sort of push to sort of say turnout's going to be high. It probably won't be as high as, we usually don't have as high as a presidential election. But given the access to sort of what we see with the high spending, there's a lot of money in politics. We have a Senate and a House that are up for grabs. We have at least one battleground House seat with Michigan 7, probably maybe another, given sort of the leaning towards the Democrats in the House. We have a very close Senate race. So you're going to see a lot of spending. And that is at least not going to make people happy about politics, but it is going to make them sort of pay attention and think that they should vote. And so we saw that already in August with a lot of campaign advertisement spending. We're going to see that again. We should expect turnouts to be high. It doesn't necessarily people are going to be happy to vote for their candidate. They might be sick of politics. So, when we look at sort of that high turnout, we're going to have maybe up close to 5 million. That'd be, crazy to think of, but it's possible given what we have in terms of the amount of spending that's going to be happening in Michigan, our change in voting laws and the degree to which we have so many different campaigns going on here.
That's Corwin Smith. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at Michigan State University. Professor, thanks so much for talking us through this.
Thank you, Zoe.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I'm Zoe Clark. Let's talk again next week.